Welcome back to Philosophy Unscripted. Most of the videos on this channel are professional presentations or chapters from my own writing that I've published over the years. But this video is part of a series where I'm just sharing some thoughts off the top of my head about some topics that have been on my mind recently. So I was at a conference a couple weeks ago, and a presenter gave a paper on empathy, kind of a philosophical reflections on empathy. And that's philosophically not a topic I'm super familiar with. I was familiar with Edith Stein's work on empathy, just the title of her book, but have not studied it at all, really. And part of the motivation for the paper, as it was presented, was in response to various contemporary, mostly Christian, books or podcasts or YouTube videos on things like toxic empathy. In fact, I think there's even a book recently of that title, Toxic Empathy, or Suicidal Empathy. I've heard that as a phrase. So this got me wondering about about empathy. So I did just briefly looked at Stein's a few lines from Stein's book on empathy, and from what I understand, she's trying to do is give an analysis of the nature of empathy from a phenomenological perspective. That is, what exactly is this thing we call empathy? And she does it based on our experiences of the thing. And those experiences, from what I could tell, seem to be something like, look, we experience empathy when we attempt to give an account of what it's like for us to feel or be aware of or sense someone else's mental states, particularly I think an emotional one. She gives the example of pain. So what is it? What is it for me to understand your pain? If you're in pain, and I want to empathize or instantiate the state of affairs of empathy within me for your pain, what exactly is that? And then she tries to give a philosophical, phenomenological account of those states. There was some, just briefly looked at a couple lines from her ideas regarding the value of empathy. And one of the things she said that it has some value is in me being able to understand my own shortcomings in my interior states of having the right sort of goodness or badness or value within myself. So I think that I understand the concern of the presentation that was given at this conference on Christians' attempt to simply dismiss empathy as either intrinsically unimportant or at worst somehow harmful. So I think there's something to be said for thinking about empathy philosophically, and I'm not sure if empathy is a virtue as such. I don't recall it being listed in any of the classical Aristotelian virtues, and I can't think of it listed as a Christian virtue unless it's the virtue of charity. Um, Love as a kind of empathy. But even there, I'm not sure. Whether or not virtue is a good intrinsically for human life, part of me thinks it is. That is, my ability to understand someone else's emotional state, if that's what if empathy is only directed towards emotive states, then I think that can be a good thing. It helps me understand you or my loved ones or just anyone as a person, what they're going through and why. Might help me counsel them, might help me allow me to just help them in their grief, be with them, care and concern. I don't know, I think of Jesus having compassion on the crowds because they were without a leader. That kind of compassion, I think, maybe is related to empathy as well. He was attempting to understand their situation and see it from their point of view, maybe. But one of the things that came up in the discussion of empathy, and this is where I think there is some major concern from Christians among others for empathy. One of the things that came to mind when just the topic of empathy was raised was a line from C.S. Lewis. I think it's from The Four Loves, but I think he got it from a philosopher or thinker named Denis de Rougemont, whose book I think is called Love in the Modern World. And I think Lewis quotes from him directly, and I'm just going to paraphrase here since this is just a philosophy unscripted. But the line goes something like this: "Love ceases to be a demon when love ceases to be a god," and that just reminded me about empathy. And I think empathy might be the same kind of thing, that empathy can cease to be a demon when empathy ceases to be a god. That is, I think that if empathy is an attempt by me to understand someone else's situation, especially their emotional one, whether it's pain or suffering or fear or some other emotive state, if it's an attempt for me to understand that without me becoming that person, which I think is impossible, I think that's okay as far as it goes. But if I take that attempt to grasp someone else's emotive states as being the highest thing that there is and make it a kind of idol, and say that, well, someone else's emotive state is the only concern that I should have for that person or for myself or for others that, say, are under my care, my family, my loved ones, my community, whatever, my country maybe, then that seems to be a major problem. Because then one thing, namely empathy, elevated, or as C.S. Lewis puts it in The Abolition of Man, swollen to madness and isolation vis-a-vis other maybe moral obligations or duties that I might have to others that don't involve empathy, then that seems to be a major cause of serious problems when it comes to fulfilling my moral duties to others. Trying to think of an example of this. Maybe suppose I have or someone has been in a relationship that is abusive in some way, so that someone is constantly taking advantage of me, and I wonder, wow, this relationship's not going well. Maybe I should really be empathic, empathize with this other person who's taking advantage of me or harming me in some way. And I do that, but my doing so enables that person to further engage in evil acts. That seems to me a kind of toxic empathy, an empathy that does no good, because I've elevated it to something that is beyond what the other person needs. The other person who's being abusive or is being doing something that's harming to me or to others, that they might not benefit simply by having someone empathize with them. In fact, sometimes doing so might create great harm. And perhaps that's what, I haven't read any of these other Christian authors who've written on the putative vices or extremes of empathy being harmful, but I suspect that's probably one of their major concerns. One of the candidates that a couple of the people that were mentioned in the presentation were Bonhoeffer and Emmanuel Levinas, and Edith Stein. And I kept thinking, these are people who certainly seem to model empathy, but one of the things they didn't do, as far as I know, was attempt to engage in empathy for the kinds of political systems that persecuted them in such a way that enabled them to do the persecuting. In other words, any attempt to take empathy and make it the kind of thing which enables great evils to oneself or to one's loved ones or one's community or even one's country seems to me a kind of elevation of empathy to a kind of form of idolatry, making it a god, and thus it becomes a demon, becomes something of great harm. This also, in the presentation and the brief discussion of empathy that came up, was some ideas about, they kept coming to mind, was two things. One, to other things other than the Rogemont quotation. One is the way in which empathy is the kind of thing which can have the wrong object as its affective status, in its affectation. And this is also brought up in the presentation, I thought rightly recognized, that Augustinian conception, it's in the Christian tradition, of ordo amoris, that is, properly ordered loves. So I think, too, there can be properly ordered empathy, even if one gives a full analysis of what empathy is, assuming that we can grasp what it is and engage in acts of empathy. It may be possible for me to empathize with in the wrong way, at the wrong time, with the wrong person in the wrong circumstances. And this is where I don't think empathy may be a virtue. Maybe it is, or maybe it's part of one of the classical virtues of Aristotle. I don't think it's listed anywhere in Aristotle. And again, the Christian virtues, maybe it's, again, like part of charity. But it seems like I can exercise empathy disorderly, in the wrong way, with the wrong person. Sometimes it's probably better not to empathize with someone. Sometimes it's better just, especially if they're doing grave evil acts, it may be best to just do one's best to put a stop to them, and then try and help the person in other ways. Maybe then being able to understand the person's motivation, what it's like for them to have been through the things they've been through, but not when it's enabling. So I think empathy can be disordered. And this also reminded me of some work that I've done wrote a brief article a few years ago on emotions and their correspondence to reality. So I'm a correspondence theorist about truth, but I'm also a correspondence theorist about emotions. I think emotions can be congruent to the realities that they are directed towards or are a result of. In other words, I can have the wrong emotive state directed towards an object that doesn't merit it. It doesn't correspond to, it doesn't fit with. So that is, my emotions can be disordered. And so if empathy is a kind of emotive state, which I think it's probably related to, I haven't thought this through very well. If empathy is a kind of emotive state, and if emotions can correspond or be congruent to the realities they're directed towards, then I think also empathy can be disordered in many ways. I think probably the books and things that are out there warning about empathy's misuse and disordered probably focus on this quite a bit, especially in the political realm. And I think probably over the last, what year is it? 6 years or so, 7 years or so. There's been a great deal of thinking about the role of empathy in political life, especially amongst those with whom we disagree. And it seems like the empathy is supposed to only go one direction. I'll leave that to your imagination, which direction that is. But it rarely seems to go from one side of the aisle to the other, but only in one sort of direction. I don't know. That's probably beyond what I want to talk about here in this discussion of empathy, but that's something I suspect. And I think the people responding to these, again, I haven't read many of these books, but any of them at all, really. So I can't speak to that, but I suspect there's some concerns with that. So empathy, I think it's probably a good and not something that's intrinsically a problem if it's simply understood as the awareness of what it's like for someone to be in a particular emotive state and to understand that state as if I were that person without me becoming that person, and identifying with them. And recognizing that empathy has a proper place and that it can be elevated to being the kind of thing which is beyond the pale of what it should be. Just like any particular emotion or any value can be elevated to a state where it becomes just crazy and makes things really disordered. And then emotions, if empathy is an emotion, it can also be incongruent to the situation at hand, as well as being properly, not properly ordered as a kind of love. If empathy is related to charity, then, and if charity, love can be disordered, have love the wrong things in the wrong way at the wrong times, then I think empathy could probably be disordered like that too. So anyway, it's kind of interesting, something to think about. Empathy, I don't think is going away. Maybe it shouldn't, but it's an interesting topic to think about. All right, have a good one.